Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A couple of years ago, in October of 2023, we had Greg Lukianoff, the CEO and president, an important man of FIRE, Free Expression, Free Expression Organization. And at that time, Greg had authored or co-authored a book called Canceling of the American Mind, where he seemed to think that universities had become perhaps a little woke and that it was very hard for students who were on the conservative side to express themselves. 2 years later, everything's changed, of course. Biden is no longer in power, Trump is in power, and the universities have become, in some ways, the center of the firestorm when it comes to free speech. So I thought it'd be good to have Greg back. He noted before we went live that you're a little too busy these days, Greg.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I have that kind of job that you don't want me to be too busy. If you defend civil liberties, you want me to be bored.
Yeah, well, that's why we have you on. If you were bored, we wouldn't have you on. You're certainly not boring. Has the shoe gone on the other foot now? I mean, 2 years ago, you and I agreed and in some ways disagreed about how free or unfree speech was in the university. Has the whole thing been turned on its head in Trump's America?
Well, I think campuses still need a great deal of reform. I think that, yeah, I think it's been all turned on its head. Trump's, is going after essentially what he sees as, and I think probably correctly, as sort of places of left-leaning power. So his three first targets were media, law firms, which actually I think is probably the least appreciated and most dangerous thing that he's doing. That I think partially because people have no sympathy for law firms. They don't care as much, but it's very important what's going on there. And of course, higher ed. And like I said a minute ago, I think higher ed does need reform, but I feel like the Trump approach is both completely illiberal. He's assuming powers he simply does not have, which is scary as hell. At the same time, doing things that actually aren't going to promote any useful reform at all. So it's been an exhausting time because there are a lot of people who elected Trump thinking he was going to address a lot of problems. And I think it's a weird combination of he's using powers he doesn't have to do things he shouldn't be doing, to constantly losing in court. On a First Amendment basis, and including lawsuits that we have brought, and so yeah, things are worse.
Wow, they're worse. Worse than the McCarthyism in the university. You're a lawyer. You graduated from Stanford Law, like my wife. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the legal community made a significant error in not aggressively pushing back? I always assumed that the one thing lawyers could do is look after themselves in court. Yeah. Why did some of them at least roll over?
Gotta say, for some of the early ones, and to be fair, like Covington and Burling, like it fought from the very beginning. But a lot of the other law firms, they caved almost immediately to the pressure from the Trump administration. And it's hard to see that as anything other than just self-interest. Essentially, they were afraid of losing their security clearance, which I'm in D.C. at the moment, and losing your security clearance in D.C. means you effectively can't do your job. But also saying that you couldn't enter federal buildings as a lawyer is also saying that you can't, because of course courts are in federal buildings. So I've never seen anything quite like that, in American history, where and the failure to stand up for those initial firms has been all the more underlined by the fact that those who have defended themselves, and those who have fought back have largely won. So I think it's cowardice and self-interest, to be honest. And it's funny, like reading some of the letters why, some of the initial firms caved. They try to make it sound like, well, this is an existential battle, for the law firms. Like if we lose these things, we lose everything. And it's like, yeah, that's why you fight then.
Yeah, and at places like Stanford and Harvard and Yale, half the courses I know you take when you're a law student are on ethics and law. Did the kids who graduate from these top law schools, did they simply ignore what they were taught in law school?
Well, you really don't learn that much about ethics in law school.
Maybe you should learn a bit more.
I do think a lot of law firms are quite mercenary in pursuing their bottom line. And I don't want to be so cynical as to assume that it has always been thus. When I've talked to people at some of the newspapers, for example, and they've watched Paramount and CBS try to placate the Trump administration. They've said, the old management never would have done this. And I believe that's true. I do believe like a couple decades ago, you would have had more of a go to hell spirit from the government trying to pull some of the stuff it's currently trying to pull. But some, to be fair, ultimately some of the law firms have stood up for themselves. Harvard has stood up for itself. If Harvard with they have as much money in the bank as the GDP, I think, of like Lithuania or something like that. It's just completely nuts. If they didn't stand up, then really kind of nobody could. And it's good they did, because the Trump administration threw everything in the kitchen sink at them. Honestly, like in a very poorly structured, poorly thought out kind of scorched earth approach, which just meant they lost a lot in court.
What is Trump in particular and his administration, in your view, up to? I always get the sense with him that it's all exhibition, it's all performance, it's all how people see him. Is he really serious about shutting down free speech, do you think?
When it comes to what I think they're trying to do, is I think that there is sort of like and I don't mean like good, but I mean rational core to what they're trying to do, which is essentially to reduce the power of left-leaning institutions that they believe are too powerful as part of the idea. And it's constantly frustrated by Trump himself, because like if you look at the approach that, for example, like the Jimmy Kimmel FCC thing, which we were talking all about, a cannier FCC and a cannier administration could have gotten away with it, essentially by quietly exerting pressure behind the scenes here and there, poking here and there. They could have gotten away with it because there would have been no proof, essentially, that it had been some degree of FCC pressure and the Trump himself pushing this. But Trump wants credit for all of this stuff. So he's constantly saying things like, well, yeah, we're going after you for your viewpoint, which lawyers, like particularly if you have constitutional lawyers on your team, are just like, no, that means we're going to lose. That means we're going to lose in court. That's viewpoint discrimination. That's like the sine qua non of what you're not allowed to do under the First Amendment. But partially because of, I think, frankly, because of ego in a lot of cases. And also he's just very erratic and undisciplined. And I think that some of the things that the people who are trying to sort of pursue this sort of aggressive conservative agenda in his administration are constantly getting frustrated by his, for example, Truth Social posts, where he made it very clear that he wanted to go after Jimmy Kimmel next, and I guess Seth Meyers and the other dude who I forgot.
Were they really offended then, do you think, by some of the jokes about the Kirk assassination, or did they just, again, use it as an excuse, given this seems to be the third rail of American politics?
I think they were, because after Kirk was killed, and I am actually, by the way, I'm speaking at Utah Valley University next week.
Whoa, you better be careful, Greg.
I'm a little, I don't, my speech is going to be about like, I'm a little scared, and that's insane. But I also make the point that I'm currently scared that fire is in court with Trump himself, because he goes after all of his enemies. So the idea that in a free society, I'm afraid both of speaking on a college campus and taking on the president of the United States for going after his enemies is not where we're supposed to be, at least in an ideal state, and not where I'd even thought we would be maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, since things started getting sort of like really crazy. I do think that they were offended by what Jimmy Kimmel said, because the quote was, essentially saying that they're trying to prove that it's anybody, the shooter was anybody but someone on their side, which implies, like the media was initially doing, and I thought I was kind of cringed a little bit, that essentially arguing that the guy who shot Charlie Kirk was probably a right winger, and I had friends call me up being like, "Oh, it's okay. It's actually like it's not that bad. Like it's a right winger. It was a right wing family." And I was like, "Since when does coming from a right wing family mean that you necessarily grow up exactly like that?" So I think they were offended, but do I think they also they've been turning this into an opportunity to go after all of their enemies, doubtlessly, and the whole week after Charlie Kirk was murdered, was the Trump administration basically, I don't know if you'd call it rediscovering, but so for example, there were things that the right, and I think very rightfully, criticized as tools that the left would sometimes use to go after speech. So misinformation, disinformation was a favorite argument of the Biden administration. But of course, one of the Trump, that Brendan Carr, by the way, the head of the FCC, was very critical of. And that was part of their rationale for saying, like, that joke, I guess, was misinformation was one argument. They also rediscovered hate speech and basically said the people who were saying, and some of them were, I think, I even was offended by, like, anyone who says basically like that Nazi had it coming. I'm like, okay, that's.
If you can offend Greg Lukianoff, you've done a good job.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, back down. But some, but obviously protected, to be clear. But some of it was just like, I didn't agree with the guy. I didn't like his politics. I didn't like what he said. Totally protected and unquestionably so. And the extent to which they've gone after people who have said things like that, in public life, on campus. We have a ton of cases like this right now at Fire. And also, they just kicked out like 6 people on student visas for saying that essentially he was a bad person.
Yeah,
so they're exploiting this to the hilt, which is also ironic because Charlie Kirk himself said the FCC should not be used for censorship. Hate speech is protected speech and should be. So it definitely was an opportunistic opportunity. They approached this opportunistically, and they continue to.
Do you think if the Mangione assassination of the United Healthcare executive had happened later, maybe after Kirk, that one would have become a huge issue too?
Yes, absolutely.
In what way?
I think that the Trump administration has shown that it's willing to use practically every lever at its disposal to go after its real or perceived enemies. And if Mangione, killing that guy, the United Healthcare CEO, had produced a lot of, right on from people Trump already didn't like, I think that they would have, like, let's say the causation, like you said, what was in the other direction.
I mean, he became a hero among some progressive kids,
which of course I think is super gross, but protected, to be clear. And I do think they would have exploited it if, for example, and actually the test case is going to be, and this is a horrible thing to say, but I think it's increasingly likely, to be honest, that if something like that happens again, they will exploit it.
Violence is the heart of the matter. What does the law tell us about what we can and can't say, Greg?
So generally, there's an idea that a sort of straw man version of the First Amendment, and I've learned this quite a bit, is that we are a free speech absolutist nation. And we aren't. I'm not a free speech absolutist. I have called myself an opinion absolutist, and I'll explain what that means. But when it comes to free speech, nobody believes, for example, that true threats should be protected. Or, sorry, almost nobody believes that true threats should be protected. And true threats are defined as things that would place a reasonable person in fear of bodily harm or death. It's very contextual, but basically kind of like the idea of in a situation where it seems likely I know where you live and I'm going to kill you. Type threats. That's not protected.
And
Incitement
there's
to
a lot of that on social media, isn't there?
Oh, there is. And actually I've been it's one of the rare places I'm saying you need to enforce these more aggressively because I believe the failure to investigate and punish true threats, which should not be protected, has led to a lot of free speech skepticism because then people incorrectly think this is protected speech when it's not. And I think that in cases where it's a legit threat on someone's life, that person should be pursued and prosecuted because otherwise it creates this idea that it's like, oh my God, people can even threaten my life and try to scare me out of my livelihood or hunt me down at home. Of course, free speech is insane, but
I mean, so people, for example, especially men who seem to be threatening women with rape or killing them, I mean, that's illegal.
Yeah, yeah. Saying something really ugly, like I think you should, like something like that. But I've had this happen. Actually, recently, my co-author Ricky Schlott,
who came on the show too.
I don't know if she's going to be okay with me talking about this, but yeah, she got some true threats directed at her pretty recently, and I think partially because of the killing of Charlie Kirk.
From the right,
actually, weirdly, from the left. She'd said something. Actually, it was. I think the guy must be completely nuts because she had said something basically being critical of people getting punished for saying, unkind, shall we say, things after the murder of Charlie Kirk. And some lefty dude on it decided that was, somehow managed to get mad at her. And, I won't go into the details of exactly what he said.
That's very troubling.
But yeah,
there's a common narrative on the left, of course, that the Supreme Court is in Trump's pocket, especially when it comes to these issues. Is that your reading, your analysis?
I think it's more complicated than that. I think the Supreme Court's actually been pretty good at standing up to him on a variety of things. Just they are quite conservative, and they have different readings on some case law. But I haven't seen anything. To be clear, I've disagreed with some of their holdings, but I haven't seen fealty to them from the courts. And I will say that I think the Republicans have not been standing. I mean, sorry, I barely have to say I think. The Republicans have not been standing up to Trump in a meaningful way.
Yeah, which is true across the board, not just in free speech.
In everything, yeah. And doing things that executive power usually isn't allowed to do. But the bulwark has been the courts so far. And as best I can tell, at least, that bulwark is at least mostly holding.
So the system is working in terms of this, what some people call a stress test of democracy.
So far.
And what do you fear upcoming in the next 6 months or a year? Are there major cases, Supreme Court cases, issues that might change the narrative?
Our big red line is if he just stops following the courts entirely. And I don't like to say that as if I think that's likely, because that just seems like very apocalyptic and dark. But at the same time, like, would I be totally shocked? Unfortunately, no.
So how would that work? What would that mean?
Like if you had a ruling against you, for example, that you couldn't deploy, troops or National Guard or federalize it. And you just said to the court, listen, like you made this, like Andrew Jackson said, that the court made the ruling, let it enforce it. I'm going to continue treating the troops as federalized. And then you're in a genuine constitutional crisis. And I think we've had minor versions of this that haven't quite gotten to the level of holy shit, we're in trouble. But it's what are we, 9 months in?
And this issue, you brought it up earlier, of deporting students for speaking out about stuff that makes the Trump people unhappy, particularly on Gaza.
Yeah.
This is profoundly troubling, isn't it? I don't quite understand in legal terms how they can get away with it, especially if these people are green card holders.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a lawsuit against Marco Rubio's power right now. So there's two provisions that give Marco Rubio power. They were originally passed in the 50s, but modified in the 80s to kick out people who are basically to kick out any non-citizen from the United States if, in his sole opinion, they are adverse to foreign policy. Now, that's a ridiculous amount of power to give one man, and it's unreviewable. There's another policy in federal law that says that basically even eliminates that special exception. So we're challenging both provisions from Marco Rubio in court right now because we believe this is too much, gives them too much power. Now, what's amazing about these provisions is they've only been challenged once previously, and the one other time they were challenged, they were ruled unconstitutionally broad and vague and too much of a delegation of power to the Secretary of State and ruled unconstitutional by Trump's sister. Um,
Mm.
the case was unfortunately overturned for completely unrelated reasons. But the only time, and she was a serious lawyer. She was a serious judge. She unfortunately died in 2023. And so we believe we stand an honest chance of getting this. But basically, they're holding their hat on this special power of the Secretary of State, which we believe is an unconstitutionally broad delegation of power.
Is there anything that's happened over the last couple of years that we should celebrate? The free press acquisition, for example, by CBS. Barry Weiss is more prominent. Some people may not like her politics, but they celebrate the fact that some of these big media companies are a little bit more ideologically balanced now. Is this good news for free speech in America, Greg?
As far as I'm concerned, if you have institutions that actually disagree with each other more and don't look as much like each other, I think that's healthy. I think that basically if there was suddenly imposition of like, every network in the country suddenly has to have someone like Barry in charge of it, I'd be a little more like, okay, that's not so great. Having CBS News, take a little bit of a different perspective, and particularly, I respect Barry a lot. And I don't always agree with her on stuff, that for sure. But at the same time, I think that like a big change up in a place that isn't like as influential as it used to be could actually be healthy for democracy. So I believe that you like having different kind of nodes of power that disagree with each other is much healthier for a free society than having too much agreement. And by the way, this is interesting. This is something that people miss. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, 1859, one of the brilliant argument. Well, just he was such a smart dude. But people forget that he actually was very clear. He actually thought the state of the law in Britain as of 1859 was quite strong. And there was good reason to think that. There was this famous case where the newspapers won in Britain in 1858. But it was a crushing sort of like upper class conformity that was actually really harming Britain. So I think that I do think that having some diversity, among the different institutions is healthy.
Yeah, and I'm struck with how odd it is that the lightning rod for all this has become American policy in Gaza and towards Israel. How does this compare with the 60s and Vietnam? Was there a movement by Nixon or LBJ to shut people up?
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And in terms of like the parallels to what Trump is doing, Nixon is oftentimes like the best person to compare it to, because Nixon too, thought of the media as what, the enemy of the people. He had COINTELPRO, which went after activists, and actually tried to generate sort of like propaganda against them to some degree. And I always try to not oversimplify some of these things. I always try to point out, for example, during McCarthyism, there were real spies in the United States, and that was scary as hell. But at the same time, the fact that history is always a little bit more complicated doesn't mean that what Nixon did was justified. And like what we're currently seeing is Trump being willing to publicly use every lever of power he has at his disposal. It does make you a little bit like, what are we going to learn behind the scenes, is going on as well, because it took us a long time to even know about COINTELPRO, for example.
Yeah, and I'm curious. You travel a lot. You say you travel too much. You're taking on
Yes, I do.
Rubio. You're also taking on Indiana University's censorship of student media. What's
Yeah.
it like? My kids have left college now. You probably spend much more time than me on campuses. Are the students nervous? Is there a sense of self-censorship? What's happening in classrooms and even when they talk to one another? Or is this perhaps a little overblown?
I was at University of Missouri, and I generally think of big state schools as more intellectually healthy than elite colleges, for example. Partially because, and this is, kind of shows my cards on this stuff. I think that economic class diversity is actually some of the healthiest diversity you can have, because I think that people who come from different economic backgrounds, there's enough diversity again of ways of thinking about things, enough pragmatism to kind of ease sort of the ideological stuff that. And again, I'm going to show my cards on this. The upper class tends to be a little more groupthinky. So University of Missouri, is
Say that again. The upper class tends to be more group thinking.
more groupthinky. Yeah,
Yeah,
yep.
interesting. Go on.
That definitely my experience when I got to Stanford, for example. I was like, wow, this is a more rigid way of looking at the world than I was
Well, my
expecting.
wife's from the working class, and she's very rigid.
Oh, no, I believe.
I'm joking. I'm teasing you.
Oh, okay. And I'm not saying that people from working class aren't necessarily rigid. They can be for sure, but I do think that there's a pragmatism of kind of like, I'm not going to believe your whole package.
Yeah. But do you think that some of this is convincing progressives that their narrative on race, on gender, on identity, maybe even on economic inequality, that it's open for debate and that they can't simply assume it's true?
I think that also debate is crucial because and I've got to go back to Mill, but he's just so freaking smart on this stuff.
Yeah.
Basically, in a truth-seeking, and I call this Mill's trident. This is my name for it. There are only three possibilities. Either you're wrong, and free speech is essential because someone needs to tell you you're wrong or convince you you're wrong. Two, you're partially right and partially wrong, which is most of the time, and you get closer to the truth through conflicting with debate, discussion, additional evidence in particular, all this kind of stuff. But even if you're entirely right, you still need that combat of ideas, because then you just hold your beliefs like you hold a prejudice, something that you know is true, but you don't know exactly, you're a little fuzzy on why. And I see this, by the way, on
Well, I
campuses
mean, it's
all the
citing
time.
Mill on liberty. I mean, doesn't he make the argument on liberty that almost that for societies to progress or develop, minority opinion is essential because that's the only thing that gets people thinking or re-examining core beliefs.
Yes, if all but one, in the world disagreed, that would still be valuable. And I think that's someone who loves the role of the nonconformist, the role of of the gadfly, who, by the way, gadflies aren't always right, but they do get you thinking.
What about the Pentagon press stuff? Is that
Oh man, yeah.
particularly? I mean, some of this stuff for me, you read it and you think, are they making it up? Is it Colbert or Kimmel making this stuff up? But it's actually true.
Yeah, geez, it's like I said, it can be kind of hard to keep up. The Pentagon press stuff is terrible. The idea that they've essentially dissolved the Pentagon press corps, unless you agree to essentially treat anything you find out as wartime information. Like if we were in a life or death declared war struggle against Nazism, it might be allowable to basically say, listen, you have to, like, if you found out stuff from us, you have to confirm with us that you got it right. I still don't like it, and I'd still probably go to court against it. But like under those circumstances, we've had circumstances kind of like that in the past. The requirement for the press corps was agree to this insane idea that essentially you can still get in trouble even if you reveal unclassified information that you learned as part of the Pentagon press corps, that you still have to run it by us. Rightfully, Very few news outlets agreed to this. The Fox News said go to hell, and most other institutions. I think that the fact that the Federalist and I mean, One America News or whatever they're called, agreed to it. I think they should be a little ashamed of that.
To put it mildly. The
Yeah.
only thing that sometimes occurs to me is we live in such an age of media, if not freedom of expression. You can go on TikTok or Facebook or Instagram. You can have a podcast. You can do anything you like. You can be on
Mhm.
Substack. How does that play into this attempt? Is there a King Canute quality of what Trump's trying to do? It's almost absurd to try and stop people saying stuff he doesn't like in an
Yeah.
age of remarkable, through technology, remarkable freedom of expression.
I honestly see a little bit of a different global picture at the moment. I see, China and Iran, for example, and for that matter, Russia, able to achieve a level of surveillance and control that actually made the old version of it seem like child's play. So I think the unfree world is worse than it was. I think the free world, I think, European Union, Britain, Canada, I think that they've been really clamping down on speech in ways that a lot of times Americans don't understand. And I think that America is probably the closest to a free speech purist, shall we say, kind of country, and we're blowing it here too. And this technology that you're talking about is very liberating, but we're developing technologies that allow unparalleled levels of surveillance, if we want to unveil it that way. And worst of all, we're developing technology that, if we don't think about it well enough, becomes the sort of my friend Brendan McCord puts it really well, can become sort of the autocomplete for life, the thing that you
Yeah.
always go to get
Right,
advice.
and that's of course AI. Maybe next time we talk, we can talk about AI. Final question or final couple of questions, Greg.
Sure.
For people who care about this, what can they do in terms of fire? I know I was just at your website. You're not shy to ask for money from people. And secondly, even if they don't give money to fire or get involved with fire, what can people actually do to protect individuals who don't own law practices or run big universities? What can they do to protect free speech in America?
I think that the biggest tool that the Trump administration has in its sort of rhetorical arsenal, and they play it to death, is essentially whataboutism. To say, where were you on blah? And I think,
Antifa and all that
yeah,
stuff. Right?
exactly. So being consistent and across the board, even if you weren't in the past, it's never too late to start. So I do think that development of that credibility that you will stand up for even people you disagree with is some of the most potent and powerful behavior you can engage in. And I do think that I'm working on a book where we talk a lot about truth seeking and like the idea that you need structured friction in order to have a better appreciation of the truth. And
Are you
I
doing
do.
it with hate or on your own?
I have to keep some of the details quite.
Okay. Well, you have to come on the show. When's it out?
Well, I hope not in too long, maybe like a year. But I can't stop thinking about it, to be completely honest. And it's kind of like taking a neuroscience approach to it. So it's all sorts of intellectual fun for me. But the point being that essentially, like, I've been trying to think about ways that people can kind of like understand the Buddhist idea that we are not our thoughts, and that also means that you are not your beliefs, and try to actually be in a situation where you're not immediately grasping your chest if someone disagrees with you, because I think that we need that kind of healthy open-mindedness to combat blinding certainties.
Maybe we need Buddhism. John Stuart Mill, of course, was fluent, I think, in Greek and Latin by the time he was about 2.5.
Yes, he was. He was
Greg
a clever
Lukianoff,
fellow.
Yeah, Greg Lukianoff might not be quite John Stuart Mill. He's the best we got. Congratulations. Keep doing your great work, Greg, and we'll get you back on. Next time when the book comes out, we'll definitely get you back on. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Great seeing you, Andrew.